Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to sit down and make a more personal video today after reading the latest in the series of attacks that the New York Times has decided to launch against faith and the arts, specifically against Falun Gong and Shen Yun. And their latest article attempts to paint people who practice Falun Gong as mindless zealots who are almost controlled into devoting their time and resources to some spiritual end. And this bigoted, reductionist, and dishonest framing stands in stark contrast to my lived experience of practicing and volunteering for the better part of 20 years. And so I thought it might be helpful if I shared my personal story and some of the amazing people that I've met along the way. And so personally, I began practicing Falun Gong at the age of 20, and I grew up middle, upper class, was in a great college at the time, but I had problems drinking, and I really wanted to stop. And I was introduced to Falun Gong meditation and the teachings, and for me, it was the first time in my life that I felt a connection with a way to improve myself that I could relate with. And the simple principles of truth, compassion, and tolerance spoke to me. And I liked that the practice had no formal temple or dogmatic rules and was entirely free. And since the meditations were free online and so were the books, I could practice or not practice as I pleased. And as I started to read the teachings and try to improve myself morally and started meditating and looking inward and reflecting on myself, I totally changed. I stopped drinking, I doubled my GPA, and for the better part of the last 20 years, I've become a successful professional, a husband, and very proudly a father. And I owe my ability to kind of take the good and the bad in life to my faith in Falun Gong. And that's the practice that Falun Gong gave me for free. And nobody's ever forced me to practice or not practice, and that's actually part of the teachings too, that people are free to stay or go, and it all has to be a personal choice. But the New York Times series of biased articles, which honestly largely mirror the same CCP propaganda from the early 2000s, want to paint practitioners as a weird fringe zealot group. But that's not who I am, and that's not who any of the people who practice Falun Gong that I know are. And I think what's important here is that what the Times fails to mention in any meaningful detail, and has failed to mention in any meaningful detail over the last almost 20 years, is one of the largest instances of religious persecution in Chinese history, the persecution of Falun Gong, which is ongoing to this day. So this overlooked detail adds incredibly important context to why Falun Gong has so many active volunteers and people who devote their time and resources to help their brethren in China. And I do it personally to speak up for those who are being persecuted to death for their faith under the hands of the CCP, because those are people that cannot speak up for themselves. And I honestly think that's the least that I can do. And having grown up in the Jewish faith, I learned the saying, never again. And I learned that's important to speak up for those who can't speak up for themselves. And so for almost 2 decades, nobody's ever asked me for a penny, and I've freely, willingly, and happily given my time to do the best that I can to help end this brutal persecution. And I'm sure when you look at millions and millions of Falun Gong practitioners, it's probably not hard to find a spectrum of people. And I suppose if you dig hard enough, it isn't too difficult to find a handful of people to support a biased narrative. But that narrative is not the hundreds or more practitioners that I've met over the years from all walks of life and from all corners of the globe. And as far as Shen Yun goes, I've also volunteered to help Shen Yun before, because honestly of the effect that I've seen that it's had on the world and their mission. They want to revive culture before communism, true Chinese culture that was for thousands of years based on Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and it's a culture of faith in the divine. And similar to the Renaissance painters, who all started the Renaissance with religious paintings, art often has a deep spiritual motivation that comes from divinely inspired culture. And this is not only normal, but also what makes Shen Yun unique. And so are the religious works of Da Vinci or Michelangelo the works of mindless zealots too? I mean, personally, I would have loved to have been around to volunteer to hand Michelangelo a brush. So as it turns out, volunteering for human rights and having religious beliefs are normal in American society, as well as globally. And many religions actually practice some form of tithing, where a percentage of their salary goes to the church or the other religious institution. And even from if they have a business, they'll have a percentage of tithing for that. And I have some friends that adhere to that. But to be clear, Falun Gong doesn't have any tithing requirement, and donating isn't part of Falun Gong teachings. But that said, I don't think it's odd if people do decide to donate some of their resources of their own free will to help both a religious cause or simply the human rights crisis in China. That seems rather normal to me. But the New York Times would have you believe it's all a sinister money-making scheme of mindless people donating. I wonder, honestly, if they dare to comment on other religions in the same way. And overall, having grown up reading the New York Times and respecting it, I really don't know what's happened to it. And And I don't know what's become of it by allowing these attacks. They spent years now attacking Falun Gong and Shen Yun, an ethnic and religious minority performing arts company, and spent tons of time and resources. It seems quite odd and oversized to me, attacking a group of faith and minority group with their institutional power. And I think the goal seems to be so you, the American people, and people watching this around the world, don't support Falun Gong. Don't go see Shen Yun. And I'd say that's exactly the outcome the CCP has been after for over 25 years. And so that I hope before you buy into this farce of a narrative that they've crafted, you can check out some other resources like Falun Dafa Information Center, Shen Yun's own website, and educate yourself a bit about the issue. And don't let the headlines or the bias stop you from supporting a renaissance of art and helping the human rights crisis in China. Thanks for watching.